What happens when the world's largest economy tries to strong-arm the fastest-growing superpower? The US thought it could pressure China into submission by imposing new tariffs, but Beijing didn't just push back. It struck with $14 billion in retaliatory tariffs targeting America's most vulnerable industries. Now, the global trade battlefield is shifting, and the stakes are higher than ever. But will Washington regain control? Or has China just turned the tables on the entire economic order? Let's find out. For years, Washington has followed the same script: use tariffs, sanctions, and economic pressure to corner China. But in 2025, the rules have changed. When the United States imposed a 10% tax on all Chinese imports on February 4, 2025, it was supposed to be a power move, a signal that the US still controlled the global trade order. Yet 6 days later, Beijing fired back, unleashing $4 billion in retaliatory tariffs. A move so precise and calculated that it sent shockwaves through American industries. This is not just an economic dispute, it is a test of strength between two superpowers. The stakes have never been higher, and the consequences could reshape global trade forever. If Washington thought China would simply absorb the hit, they underestimated how prepared Beijing was. The counterattack was swift and strategic, leaving no room for doubt. China was playing to win. But what exactly did Beijing target, and why were these industries chosen? The retaliation was not random. Every tariff imposed by China was carefully designed to strike at the heart of the American economy while ensuring minimal damage to China itself. The biggest blow landed on the US energy sector, the American dream of dominating global energy. In markets, particularly through liquefied natural gas, LNG, and coal exports to China, has now been derailed with a 15% tariff placed on LNG and coal. American energy companies are suddenly at a disadvantage. China doesn't have to rely on US energy. It can turn to Russia, Qatar, or even expand its partnerships with Gulf states, ensuring a steady supply while leaving American firms struggling to find new buyers. Then came the blow to crude oil. The United States has increasingly relied on exporting oil to China, but now, with a 10% tax making it more expensive, Beijing is shifting its focus. Russia has already been selling oil to China at discounted rates, and Middle Eastern suppliers are more than happy to step in. The result? US energy companies lose revenue while China secures long-term energy stability. But Beijing didn't stop there. It turned its attention to agriculture, an industry that suffered immensely during the 2018 to 2020 trade war. By imposing tariffs on agricultural machinery, China has hit a sector that is deeply intertwined with the American heartland. Companies like John Deere and Caterpillar have built their business models around supplying Chinese farmers with advanced machinery. Now, with these tariffs in place, Chinese buyers will look elsewhere, perhaps to European manufacturers or domestic brands. Meanwhile, American farmers are left with rising costs and declining demand. The automotive sector is another major casualty. China has imposed tariffs on large engine vehicles and pickup trucks, sending a clear message to Ford, General Motors, and other US automakers. Their dominance in China is fading. With the rise of Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers and increased demand for European and Japanese cars, American brands are losing their competitive edge. For decades, US automakers have relied on China as a key market, but now they face an uphill battle as tariffs make their vehicles less attractive. These targeted industries represent a carefully thought-out strategy. China is not just retaliating, it is reshaping its trade dependencies. By reducing reliance on American energy, agriculture, and vehicles, Beijing is accelerating its transition towards self-sufficiency and closer economic ties, with partners that do not seek to undermine its growth. But this isn't just about tariffs. China has opened up new fronts in the economic battle, and it is using tools far more powerful than import taxes. But what else is China doing? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Africa's geopolitics, economy, and changing landscape. Let's continue. Trade wars are never fought with tariffs alone. China understands this better than anyone, and its response to Washington's aggression has gone far beyond taxing. One of the most significant moves China has made is its antitrust investigation into Google. While the US has spent years targeting Huawei, TikTok, and other Chinese tech companies, China has now flipped the script by launching an investigation into Google's dominance in the Chinese market. Beijing is signaling that no American tech giant is untouchable. If the probe leads to fines or restrictions, Google could lose billions in advertising revenue. And if this is just the beginning, other US tech companies, including Apple, could be next. But the real game changer is China's control over rare metals. These materials, used in everything from semiconductors to fighter jets, are a crucial part of modern industry. China produces over 70% of the world's rare metals, and now it has imposed export controls on 25 of these critical elements. This is not a hypothetical threat. It is an economic chokehold. The United States has no immediate alternatives, and developing new supply chains would take years, if not decades. The few other major producers, such as Australia, cannot match China's scale. History provides a clear warning. In 2010, China restricted rare metal exports to Japan, and within weeks, Japan's electronics industry was thrown into crisis. Now, the US faces the same danger. Without these materials, the American tech sector could grind to a halt. Companies like Intel, Tesla, and Boeing rely on Chinese rare metals to manufacture their products. If Beijing tightens these restrictions further, it could affect US technology and defense manufacturing overnight. Adding to the pressure, China has expanded its unreliable entity list, which now includes major American firms like PVH Corp, the parent company of Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger. This move is more than symbolic. It sends a message that American businesses operating in China are not safe from economic retaliation. If more companies are added to this list, they could face restrictions, loss of access to Chinese markets, or even outright bans. At this point, the question is no longer whether this is a trade war, it's whether this is the start of a full-scale economic conflict with no clear end in sight. The US-China trade war of 2018 to 2020 was brutal for American businesses. Tariffs on Chinese goods led to higher prices, declining exports, and stock market instability. Farmers suffered, automakers took heavy losses, and American corporations struggled to adapt. But at that time, China was still somewhat reliant on the US market. Now the situation is different. China has built stronger economic ties with Russia, Latin America, and Africa. It has diversified its trade partners, invested in domestic technology, and reduced its vulnerability to Western financial pressure. Meanwhile, the World Trade Organization, which once acted as a mediator in trade disputes, has lost its power. The US has sidelined international institutions, making it difficult to resolve these conflicts through diplomatic channels. Washington's new reciprocal tariff policy is not just targeting China. It's also alienating allies in Europe, Japan, and South Korea. The result? The US is not just at odds with China. It is increasingly isolated on the global economic stage. So, what's next? Trump has made it clear that he is in no hurry to negotiate, dismissing calls for trade talks and doubling down on his America First rhetoric. Washington seems convinced that China will eventually cave under pressure, but history suggests otherwise. Every time the US has tried to isolate China economically, Beijing has found ways to adapt, strengthen its domestic industries, and forge new partnerships. If Washington refuses to back down, China has several more cards left to play, and each one could cause severe economic disruptions for the United States. One of the most immediate responses could be the imposition of new tariffs on US tech products like iPhones, a move that would send shockwaves through Silicon Valley. Apple, which relies heavily on China for both manufacturing and sales, would face higher costs and declining demand in one of its largest markets. That alone could trigger a sell-off in the stock market, eroding investor confidence in the stability of US businesses. And if that isn't enough, China could take an even more drastic step, further restricting rare metal exports, with the US already struggling to secure alternative supplies for these critical materials. Another round of export bans